Acts chapter 21. Today we're going to be kind of looking towards here at the end of the Apostle Paul's ministry, and I want to show you some things about how Paul handles some challenging times. Now, in his particular instance, the challenge that he's going to face is persecution. He's going to face arrest. He's going to face jail time. But in the larger context of things, Paul faced a dramatic change in his plans. Does that sound familiar to you? How many of you have had a drastic change of plans recently? All right? Can we just say 2020 has been a drastic change of plan? Now, I'm going to be frank with you. I think that, we'll probably still see some of that for a while. I don't think this is going to get any easier for a little while. But how do we handle that? How do we handle it when life throws at us? Let me put it more specifically. When God throws something at us that radically changes the direction we were planning to go. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what's going on in Paul's life. Paul's completed his third missionary journey. He's been out preaching now for a couple of decades. He's made these three incredible journeys that we talk about in the book of Acts, where he has literally preached the gospel, as he says in the book of Romans, from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum. In other words, in this vast area, Paul has covered and he has preached the gospel. And he's looking for a new place to go. In fact, that's one of the reasons he wrote the book of Romans. Right there at the end of his third missionary journey, Paul's thinking about, well, where am I going to go next? What am I going to do? And I love that about the Apostle Paul. Paul wasn't thinking retirement. At this time, by the way, Paul was an old man. He has been preaching for a long time, and it's been hard. Everywhere Paul's been, he's been beaten. He's been thrown in jail. He's faced all kinds of adversity. And back then, when you were traveling, you were traveling by foot. Paul didn't have a car. He didn't have a tour bus. He didn't have an airplane or that he could get on. Paul mostly traveled by foot or by ship. And about every time Paul gets on a ship, the ship either runs into a storm or gets shipwrecked. I'm telling you, if I was wandering around with Paul, I'd be like, I'll tell you what, I'd rather swim this thing than try to get on a boat with you. But he had a very hard time. So here he is now, really late in his ministry. He's had these incredible accomplishments. And many people say, Paul, it's time to retire. It's time to hang it up. Paul, when he writes Romans, is writing that entire letter to introduce himself to the church in Rome and saying to them, I'm going to come and go to Spain. And I would like on the way to Spain, I would like to stop in Rome, preach for you. By the way, the entire book of Romans is a fundraising letter. Romans chapter 15, Paul's asking them to raise up some money to send him on his way to Spain. That's where Paul's thinking about going. But he has one stop before he gets there. He has one place that he has to go before he can go on to Rome and on to Spain. He's got to go to Jerusalem. And the reason is he's been collecting an offering in all of the churches that he had planted for the church in Jerusalem. Jerusalem of all the churches, had the most difficult time. Economically, persecution-wise, they've had a very difficult time. And Paul has raised up money, and he wants to take it back. And so in Acts chapter 20, and then going into 21 and 22, Paul is making this journey. And everywhere he goes, people are telling him, Paul, don't go. If you go to Jerusalem, one prophet says, they're going to bind you. They're going to arrest you. This is going to be difficult. And Paul knows it's likely not to be a good reception, but he knows what God has called him to do. He knows that God has put it on his heart to take this offering back, to report to the elders in Jerusalem all that he's been doing over these years. But he knows it's going to be hard. And what's interesting is when it gets there, it's far worse than he could have ever imagined. And how Paul deals with that is a tremendous lesson for Christians. Because here's the truth. The truth is there will be moments in all of our lives where we face difficult and challenging times, right? many times we will face persecution as a result of the preaching of the gospel. I think we're just becoming aware of this again here in America. But it's growing. It's a growing problem, especially as Christianity becomes a smaller portion of the population in the United States. If you don't believe that, according to Pew Research, between 2007 and 2018, the percentage of Americans who identified themselves as evangelical believers, or as Christians rather, dropped from 78% in 2007 to 65% in 2018. And that was accompanied by a rise of those who claimed no religious affiliation of 16% in 2017, up to 26% in 2018. And it's only getting more challenging. And we know this. As we look around us, there is more and more and more opposition to the preaching of the gospel right here in our own country today. So how do we face that? Well, I want to show you a few principles. The first thing I want to show you is that when we often get a wrong idea of how Paul dealt with this. I think sometimes we have this idea that Paul almost was constantly looking for a fight. That is not true. In fact, we're going to see that Paul did everything in his power to avoid confrontation. Let me show you what happened in chapter 21. Look, chapter 21, verse 17. In the previous verses, by the way, Paul has arrived, in the first part of chapter 21 is just really the itinerary of how Paul got to Jerusalem. It walks us through, and it tells us a little bit about the warnings that he had received. But in verse 17, it says, "When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. And after greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry." And notice what it says in verse 20. "And when they heard it, they glorified God, and they said to him, 'There are among the Jews, of those who have believed, the Jews,'" let me go back in verse 20. "And when they had heard it, they glorified God, and they said to him, 'You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles, to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you've come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they've been told about you, but you yourself also live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what was sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality." Then Paul, verse 26, took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them, and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one. Now, let me kind of explain to you what's going on here. When Paul arrives in the city, everything at the beginning looks okay. Paul does exactly as he should. He goes to the elders in Jerusalem, to the leaders of the church in the Jerusalem church, and he begins to give them a report. Now you notice there's no conflict here yet. James and Paul are united with one another, and they come and they hear all that God has been doing. And I would have loved to have heard that account, wouldn't you? From Paul's own words, he says he went, step by step, walking them through. This is what God has been doing in my life and in my ministry. And they glorify God. They're excited about all that God has been doing among the Gentiles through Paul's ministry. So everything looks very, very good. But they warn Paul that a nasty rumor has started. Among some of the Jewish converts to Christianity, there's a rumor that Paul has been out and he's been preaching that Jewish people do not need to be circumcised. Now, you'll remember that Paul had clearly taught Gentiles do not need to be circumcised in order to be saved. That's what the entire book of Galatians is about, right? There were some that were going around basically telling Gentile converts to Christianity, before you can really be saved, essentially you've got to become a Jew by being circumcised. And Paul didn't agree with that at all. Now, there was a reason for that. Paul understands that if you add anything to the gospel, you dilute it of its power. So making circumcision a requirement for salvation would directly contradict everything that Paul has taught. But he never taught that Jewish people should stop living basically according to their customs. What's interesting about that is as soon as Paul has, after the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, no sooner had Paul kind of won this battle, this theological battle over circumcision. Do you remember what he did? He took Timothy, who was part Jew and part Gentile. His father was a Gentile, his mother was a Jew, and Paul had him circumcised. Why did he do that? Well, it's because he knew it would be an offense to the Jewish people. But never had Paul taught that Gentiles had to be circumcised, and never did he taught that Jews should not be circumcised. They've been lying, in other words, about what Paul has been preaching. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is. For the Jewish people, this was an affront. This was an absolute blasphemy. And because Paul had been a former rabbi, they're going to seek to have him arrested. So they come up with a very interesting plan. They say, Paul, listen, there's these three fellows here that they're going to go and make a vow at the temple. You go down and you pay that price for that vow. And basically, let me sum that all up without getting into a lot of detail on what that's all about. Basically, what they're saying is, Paul, you demonstrate to them that you still are a faithful, loyal Jewish citizen. You go and you do what the law has required on this particular matter, which was no problem. Paul went and did that. What's Paul trying to do here? Paul is trying to avoid a conflict. In other words, what Paul's doing is saying, listen, in this little side matter, in this matter that really isn't that important, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to, we would say it where I'm from, I'm going to play ball here. I'm going to go ahead and show them that I'm okay. I'm not going to make a fight over this matter. Now, why would Paul do that? Well, he knew this. He knew that if he did make a fight, he was not going to get an opportunity to preach the gospel. He might get killed. And so what Paul does here is he does everything he can to avoid trouble. Now, I want you to hear this. As believers, while we are certainly to be courageous, and certainly to be fearless, and certainly to be brave in our proclamation of the gospel, we are never called to go out of our way to create conflict. In fact, when we can avoid it, we do. I think Kenny Rogers wrote a wonderful song about this. Do you not? Remember Tommy? Tommy found out, it's better sometimes. What did Tommy promise his dad? Come on, you know this song. Walk away from trouble when you can, right? Sometimes you don't have to fight every single battle. This is a battle that Paul is going to attempt to avoid. He is going to try to avoid trouble when he can. I'll never forget when I was back in West Virginia, we had a pastor friend of mine. He pastored a church right on the other hilltop. I was on one hilltop. In West Virginia, everything's measured by how many hollers and how many hills away you are, okay? And so I was up on top of one hill, and this fellow was on top of the other hill, and our churches were only probably about 2 miles apart, but it took about 30 minutes to get there by the time you wound down through all the country roads and back up the other side of the mountain. But this fella, there wasn't a problem that ever came up that he didn't want to fight someone over it. I never can forget one time. We were at a pastor's conference together. The state of West Virginia every year had a pastor's conference for us. And we went down, and we were in a place aptly named Buchanan, West Virginia. Not after me, and it's spelled differently. But anyways, we were down there, and we were all having dinner together. And he began to tell us, boy, I have problems in my church this week. Boy, we had a nasty fight. And that's really what happened. And what had happened was on the little remembrance table out front, a lady who decorated the church, by the way, a lady who I knew very well. Her husband and my mom had been friends for decades and decades and had known each other for a long time. And she had decorated the remembrance table for fall, and she was putting out, you know what a cornucopia is? It's, there's a pumpkin and there's a couple of gourds and a bunch of junk flowing out of the cords and all that kind of stuff. She was putting that up there. But the only pumpkin she had was a ceramic jack-o'-lantern. And she turned the jack-o'-lantern around so the face was turned away from the congregation. So when the congregation looked at it, it just looked like a pumpkin, right? Well, this pastor got up in the pulpit that morning and he looked at that jack-o'-lantern face and he got all bent out of shape over it. He actually called the lady out in front of the church, which is not uncommon in West Virginia. That happens quite frequently. Called her out, rebuked her publicly, and threw a fit. Now, how do you think that went? Poorly, right? Badly. He offended a whole bunch of people, got people upset. So he was sitting there and he was telling us about this, and I'll be very frank with you, I thought he was joking because I'm stupid. You understand that I'm not good in human relationships? I thought there's no way this guy could possibly have done this. And I said, oh, Casey, that's the best ministry that church has had going on for 30 years. And now you've taken their jack-o'-lantern? He was not kidding. Can I tell you what? That was a dumb fight to pick. Just be honest with you. Now, I don't care where you stand on the celebration of Halloween or your position on jack-o'-lanterns. There was a way to deal with that, and there was a way not to deal with that. And the way not to deal with it was publicly to rebuke somebody over something that was not intended at all to be what he was doing. In other words, pick the battle that you fight. Now, this is our problem as Christians for a long time in America. We've been picking the wrong battles. We've been picking the wrong fights. Our fight is not a cultural war. Our battle is for the gospel. And so Paul looks at this and he understands, listen, here's what I can do. I can just do this thing that's not really going to cost me anything, but might gain me the opportunity to preach. Now, by the way, it doesn't really work out well for Paul. And that's how it happens sometimes. Sometimes there is a fight, and sometimes you can't avoid the trouble. But Paul, as much as possible, does that sound familiar? As much as possible, live with peace with each other. In other words, let some things go. They don't matter. You don't have to fight about every matter. That's an important thing to remember because your families are coming this week, right? How many of you have ever had a Thanksgiving feud? Oh, you haven't lived until you've had a fight around the Thanksgiving table, all right? Why? Because sometimes we don't let little things just go. Let them go. Doesn't matter. Paul's going to try as much as possible to live at peace with those around him. Now, when trouble comes, Paul is going to use every advantage that God has given him. Let me show you that in chapter 21. Look what happens in verse 27. So things go pretty good for the first week. Look what happened. When the 7 days were almost completed. So for 7 days, Paul's like, hey, this worked out pretty good. There's no trouble. They're not coming and arresting me. They're not coming to fight with me. It looks like things have kind of settled down for a little bit. But look what happens. When the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. Now, there's a lesson for you to know. There's always going to be, in every crowd, some troublemakers. And there are here. There are some Jewish people from Asia. Now that's interesting because Paul had done most of his preaching in the Roman province of Asia. This is not Asia like China or Japan like we think of. This is the Roman province of Asia. And those would be many of the places where Paul preached on his second and third missionary journeys. And we know this. Some of these Jewish folks had been traveling around behind Paul everywhere he preached and were stirring up problems. So these are probably just troublemakers that have been looking for Paul to make a mistake, looking for him to do something that they could kind of get their teeth in. Now listen to me. I promise you, if you're living for God, there will be somebody in your life like that. That's just waiting to criticize you, waiting to jump on you. And that's just part of being a follower of Christ. And these fellas, they see him at the temple and they begin to stir up problems. They don't directly confront Paul. They start stirring up some of the other Jews around them. Notice what it says. It says, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and this place. Moreover, he brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Now notice what happens. They've made an assumption. Paul had not brought a Gentile, which, by the way, was against the Jewish law, into the temple. He hadn't done that. But they thought he had. In other words, this is just rumor. This is just innuendo. These are just lies that are being brought against the Apostle Paul to oppose him. And they're saying, look, he's violated our law. And they seize him and they want to have him arrested. Notice what happens. Then all the city was stirred up and the people ran together. Now, let me say this to you. There's a great instance in the Bible of the influence of the mob. Suddenly, a couple of people have made a false accusation, and cooler heads often do not prevail. Instead, a mob is instigated, and everybody gets run away with their passions, and what begins to happen? They begin to oppose. Notice what happens. Then the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came from the tribune to the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. Now let me stop and tell you what happened. The Romans had constant problems with the Jewish people. Rome was what had subjugated this area, and the Jewish people did not like that. They wanted to be free and independent, and Rome said, no, you're part of our empire. And the Jews had repeatedly rebelled against Roman rule. Now that really bothered the Romans at this point in time because they were living in what the historians will call the Pax Romana. In other words, Rome had peace all over its empire. There was nobody fighting against the Romans at this particular moment in history. And the only problem where they were really facing challenges was Jerusalem. So they put outside of the city of Jerusalem a little garrison of soldiers just in case something like this might happen. Now, when I say a little garrison, this was a large enough army to put down a fair-sized rebellion. And the tribune comes running into the city because he's hearing the alarms. He's hearing all of this trouble, and he's thinking, oh man, something's happened. They're going to revolt. And by the way, his job was to make sure that he kept the peace. If he didn't do that, this is going to be a problem. So when he gets there, notice what happens. It says he at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Now, there was a reason for that. We'll get to here in just a moment, that they are well aware of. They were not, the Romans, for all of their faults, were very law-abiding, respecting people. And they had a system of due process. You've heard that in America. We didn't invent that. We got it from the Romans. All right? and they had a way of dealing with these problems, and mob violence was not it. And so here they come down, they stop beating up Paul, and look what happens. He says, then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing and some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him be brought into the barracks. And when they came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, away with him. Now look what happens in verse 37. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, may I say something to you? And he said, do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up the revolt and led the 4,000 men of the Asians out into the wilderness? And Paul replied, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. Now that sounds, kind of innocuous until you understand what Paul did here. Paul's literally near being killed and torn apart. This is so bad and so violent that the soldiers have to pick Paul up and literally carry him out of this mess to keep him from being killed. But then when Paul begins to speak, you see something here. Paul is using some advantages. The very first thing he does is use the advantage of language. Paul was a very interesting fellow. Not only did he knew the sort of slang Hebrew that's called Aramaic that the Jewish people spoke, he also knew Latin, which was the official language of the Roman Empire, but he also knew Greek. And as he begins to speak, did you notice that the Roman centurion is astonished that he knew Greek? Now, why was Paul doing that? Paul wanted to make sure that he let this fellow know, number one, he was an educated man. Number two, he wanted to be clear about exactly what he was saying. So he is speaking. Now, I think, and I'm going to give you a little speculation here, I think as Paul was listening, he realized this centurion was speaking Greek to his soldiers. And what Paul does here is he uses the language that he recognizes the man is going to understand. But he also claims some other advantages. Paul also mentions the fact that he is a citizen of Tarsus. Now, why was that important? Well, because Tarsus is a well-known Roman city. He says, I'm a citizen of the city of Tarsus. And right away, that raised the status of this man. He's not just some random guy. This is a man from one of the leading cities in the Roman Empire. Later, he's going to even claim his own Roman citizenship. Now, what's Paul doing there? Paul realizes if he lets this thing go, the mob's going to kill him. But he begins to use the advantages that God had placed in his life. Listen, it was no accident that God called the Apostle Paul to do the things that he called him to do. Paul was the perfect person in that time and place to preach the gospel, largely for the reasons that he just mentioned. Paul could travel anywhere in the Roman Empire, and he could speak to almost anybody he met because he knew the 3 major languages that were spoke. Very few people could do that. It's likely that Peter could never have done that. Not only that, because he'd grown up in Tarsus, Paul was one of the most educated men of his day. So he was able to talk to the common average farmer, but he was also be able to speak with the leading philosophers of the day. He had an advantage. He had a Roman citizenship that guaranteed that the mob could not kill him that day without following cross with the Romans, and he claims it. In fact, Paul is going to use that right later on. He's going to spend the next several years in prison. This is not going to be easy for Paul. All right, they're not just going to have a trial and let him go. They don't know what to do with him. They know if they let him go, the Jews are going to go crazy. So the Romans are at a problem. But Paul appeals, to two different governors, and then finally says, like every Roman citizen had the right to do, I'm appealing to Caesar. In other words, I want to stand in front of the emperor of the world. We have no clue in our day and age how powerful a Roman emperor was. When we think today, we think of the most powerful person in the free world as being the President of the United States. His power pales in comparison to the power of the Roman emperor. These are some of the most powerful leaders the world has ever known. Paul says, I want to preach to him. I want to appeal to him. And his Roman citizens gives him that right. In other words, Paul's using every advantage that God has given him, not only to maneuver in this situation to avoid being killed, but far more important, to get the opportunity to preach the gospel. You don't believe that? Look what he does next. Verse 37. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, may I say something to you? And he said, do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of assassins out of the wilderness? Paul replied, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. Now that's a bold move. Hey, we're arresting you because these people obviously are unhappy with you, Paul. And Paul says, could I get an opportunity to talk to them for just a moment? And remarkably, by the way, he's given it. In verse 40, when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people, and there was a great hush. He addressed them in Hebrew. Did you know he just changed languages? He's been talking to the centurion in Greek. Now he's going to talk to Jews. And it doesn't say he spoke in Aramaic, which was the common language of the Jewish people in that day. He speaks in Hebrew. Why? Because Hebrew was the language of the Old Testament, and they're recognizing Paul is well trained in the Old Testament in his understanding, and he speaks their heart language. He speaks their language that they had been so proud of. And notice what he begins to do in chapter 22, verse 1. This is the way to get yourself out of a problem if you're ever in one. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, I am a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel. In other words, he's telling them and recounting his Jewish heritage and his training in the law. He says, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day, I persecuted this way to death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. The high priest and the whole council of the elders can bear me witness. He's telling them what they already knew. Paul had been one of the leading Pharisees of his day. Paul was on a fast track to be a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. He was a man who had been very, very zealous for the ways of Judaism. And probably everybody in the crowd understood that. They knew that about Paul. He's telling about his past and what his life had been like. And look what he says. He says, from them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed towards Damascus to take those who also were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. And as I was on my way and drew near Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. And I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one that was speaking to me. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by the hand of those who were with me and came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, to hear the word from his mouth. For you will be a witness for me, for him, to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. And when I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one of the synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed you. And when the spirit of Stephen, your witness, being shed, I myself was standing by, approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Now that's an interesting thing. Because right here, Paul shows something amazing. He says to the centurion, hey, can I talk to these folks? And the very thing that they hated the most about Paul, and the very thing that caused these people to be so angry with him, Paul stands up and he proclaims the very message that they were being persecuting him for. He stands up and he preaches the gospel to them. He says, listen, let me tell you what my life was like before I met Jesus. And he tells them all about his history in Judaism. Let me tell you about how I came to know Jesus. I was on the road to Damascus. I was on the way to persecute Christians, but Jesus appeared to me and I was blinded. And then he says, and then let me tell you about what happened after that. As a result of that, I received a call from God, and I'm summarizing this, to preach to the Gentiles. Do you see what Paul's doing? Paul's taking the opposition and the obstacle, and he's turned it into an opportunity to preach the gospel. He didn't whine about it. He doesn't moan about it. He didn't get mad about it. He doesn't fight with these folks. He doesn't stand up there and say, oh, you people are trying to take away my rights. You're trying to be mean to me. Paul just stands up and he does what God called him to do. And you know what? If you read the rest of the book, that's what he keeps doing. One governor after another summons Paul in front of them. And you know what, Paul, every time he's summoned, he preaches the gospel. Every time. Look, Paul tried to walk away from trouble when he could. He used every advantage that he had when the trouble came. But when it came, he used it as an opportunity to preach the gospel. Hey, that's how we've got to live, brothers and sisters. That's how we have to live. We can sit around and we can look at the troubles and the difficulties and the problems. You know, Jesus never promised us that we wouldn't have problems. In fact, he promises us the opposite. In this life, you will have trouble. Now, sometimes that trouble isn't really persecution. It's just the normal troubles of life. I've had 1,000 people ask me over the last 6 to 9 months, hey, do you think COVID is a judgment from God? My honest answer to that is I don't know. I really don't. God hadn't said that it was and hadn't spoken anything that it was. But it could be that it's just one of the normal things that happened in the course of life. There have been flus and sicknesses from the fall of man right to this very day. That's true. You're going to sometimes get things and you're going to face difficulties. Sometimes it is the result of God's chastening hand. Sometimes it is a result of persecution. We're going to have hard times. And in those moments, we do everything we can to try to avoid. If we can walk away from the fight, we don't have to fight every battle that comes our way. In fact, I'm going to say this. As Christians, I'm not sure that there's more than 3 or 4 battles that we're ever called to fight. In fact, I'll be very frank with you. I'm not sure that there's only just one battle we're supposed to fight. And that is for the gospel. And everything else is secondary. Because we're called to preach the gospel. And what does Paul do? Paul says, this is an obstacle. His plans got radically changed. He gets to Rome, but not the way he thought he was going. He thought he was going to get to Rome, preach to the Roman church. They would raise up money for him, send him on to Jerusalem. I personally believe, and I can make this argument if you want to after church to you, that Paul was going to move his base of operations from Antioch to Rome. And from there, he was going to continue to work his way. And if Paul lived long enough, he'd have preached in Massachusetts. If he'd lived long enough, he'd shown up here. He just kept going west. He just kept moving right along, preaching the gospel. But God had different plans. Yeah, he was going to go to Rome, but not as a free man. And even when Paul's in Roman prison, do you know what he realizes? When he's writing some of his letters, he talks about this. The fact that the Roman guard that was guarding him, many of them had become converts. The church in Philippi is writing to him at one point and saying, Paul, we've heard you've been arrested and we need to know what's going on. And Paul writes back to them all, let me tell you about it. The whole prison guard has come to know that my chains are for the gospel. You know what Paul had been doing? They locked this soldier to Paul's wrist and tell him to guard Paul. And Paul realizes this guy can't get away. Right? So what am I going to do? I'm just going to preach to him. And some of those fellas got saved as a result of Paul preaching there. That's crazy. Think about that. You get thrown in jail that you're not really thinking, hey, I ought to preach to the guard that's guarding me. Paul says, that's my audience right there. That's the guy. That's the guy that's in front of me. This is the person that's in front of me right this moment. So what am I going to do? I'm going to preach the gospel to him. When he's arrested, he goes to Caesarea. Felix comes, the governor. This is the guy that can set him free. And all Paul has to do is play ball with him. All he has to do is tell him the things that he wants to hear, and this man will probably set Paul free. But what does Paul do? He preaches the gospel to him. He goes to Rome. He preaches. I have no doubt, in my mind, we don't know for sure because Acts ends. But you know what? I think Paul did get to talk to Caesar. And I think he preached the gospel to him. And we're pretty sure from the rest of the New Testament, if we piece it together, that when Paul got out of prison, if you'd been in jail for the preaching of the gospel and you had gotten in this much trouble, many of us would have been quiet. But you know what the biblical evidence suggests to us? Paul got out of jail and went to Spain. And he just kept preaching the gospel. You know why? That's the call. We look at the problems we're facing today, and oh yes, we have obstacles and we have challenges. Can we just be honest here for a moment? I get it. 2020 has not been fun. We don't I was talking to Cliff this morning. He's got to stay home because Reagan woke up this morning with some sniffles and a little bit of a sore throat, and out of an abundance of caution, they want to make sure that she's okay. So they're going to stay home and take care and make sure everything's good. And that's like the second time now that's happened to Cliff. It's happened to me once and a half, and it's going to happen to all of us. We're going to have our lives disrupted. Now we can look at that and we can get mad about that, or we can say there's nothing in the universe that happens apart from God's plan, and look and go, you know what? Maybe God is giving us opportunities. What did Paul do? He preached to the person who was right in front of him. And sometimes that was a crowd. Sometimes that was a synagogue full of people. Sometimes it was an angry crowd trying to get to him and kill him. Sometimes it was just a Roman soldier locked to his arm. Sometimes it was one-on-one with the church members and the places where he planted. But in every place and in every way, what did he do? He just preached the gospel. Brothers and sisters, Let's put all of the side issues away. Let's stop belly aching over the fact that it's become difficult or challenging, and let's do what God called us to do. Just preach the gospel to the guy in front of you. Amen? And by the way, sometimes that means standing in front of a mirror and preaching the gospel to the guy in front of you. Y'all follow what I mean? Sometimes I have to be reminded and you have to be reminded of the gospel. Preach it to ourselves and remind us of the wonderful, the grace, the mercy, the forgiveness that is ours through Jesus Christ.